Freedom's End, SE Estes. Freedom is never dear at any price. It is the breath of life. What would a man not pay for living? Mahatma Gandhi.
Painter's Journal. Note: we go out tomorrow. If we don't stop the cannons long enough to repair the east shields of the city's second wall, we're sure to lose the war for Zaral, humanity's capital world. If Zaral falls, it won't be long before the rest of the universe follows, and all thinking beings will be enslaved to the creatures that control the mind slaves massed to take the city. It's going to be a tough fight. We're heavily outnumbered, and the thralls will fight without regard to losses. I don't know if we'll make it, so I'm entrusting this journal to Stalking Cougar, one of the leaders of this war who always manages to survive, no matter the odds. If I fall, he'll get it to Khadija, my granddaughter, who runs my gallery on Trader's Hand. Tonight is for May and me. Tomorrow, we live or die. Freedom. I remember my mother's face the day she died under the whip of a slave handler. Before her body grew cold, they took me into the mines to work. Her eyes went with me. Time had no meaning in the mines. Most days were the same, wake to the whips of the handlers. Work with little rest while trying to avoid beatings. Eat a meager meal, never enough to ease the hunger. Sleep when the pain allowed it. People dropped from exhaustion. Many never got up again. The daily dead were thrown into piles that were cleared away before the end of sleep. The living became dull, hopeless, mindless. One sleep, when I was still very young, pictures awoke in my mind, and every sleep after. I wanted them to live as long as possible, so I taught my hands to make them flow from my bloody fingers into the dirt. When my eyes could no longer focus, I slept on top of my dreams. They'd be gone when the whips came to wake me. I didn't want the handlers to see that I was different. Standing out brought beatings. If not for a series of events, I would most likely have died another beaten man who'd lost his dreams. I became captivated by a woman in my sector. Cruel labor couldn't quench an inner beauty that shone through her eyes. She shared her food with those in need, tended the sick and injured, and sat with the dying. I didn't know why she did it. Sharing and kindness were foreign to me. She was the only example of selflessness I saw since my mother died. Her eyes reminded me of my mother too. I never spoke to her because it would be an invitation for even crueler treatment if the handlers saw us together, but I hoped that one day I could choose her. One night when I was almost asleep, she came to the mat next to mine to care for an injured girl. Her kindness moved me to reach out and touch her hand. She looked at me. Yes? I've never seen anyone like you. What makes you help others when you suffer along with the rest of us? This dark place needs caring, she answered in a soft, sad whisper. One day I will choose you, I promised. We worked 20 hours a day, and on the 10th day we rested. The 10th was the time of proving, when the strongest in every sector fought for the privilege to take part in the day of choosing. On the day of choosing, the sector's champions were awarded the right to pick breeding mates. There was a particular handler called Vardok, who picked me out as his special pet. I was the first to try out his newest instruments of pain. We'd been locked in a contest for years. He kept trying to break me, and I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I worked hard, determined to win the right to pick the woman on the day of choosing, but my newfound work ethic angered Vardok. He preferred me to work only after he beat me into it. He looked for opportunities to punish me, and whether he had a reason to or not, he brutalized me at least once a day. The worse Vardok hurt me, the harder I worked, and the madder he got. When the woman finished tending the child and moved away, I felt like I was being watched, so I looked behind me. Larvik, named after sneaking creatures that hid in the shadows and fed on the dead, was another of Vardok's pets. He won himself into the big handler's favor by selling the lives of the other slaves. He reported even our slightest acts of disobedience to Vardok. Larvik would betray anyone for a piece of bread. He was the only fat person I'd ever seen. When Larvik saw me looking at him, he gave me a gloating smile and walked away. I knew that smile meant trouble. Fight! A daily occurrence, even more so the closer it got to the day of choosing. I pressed in to watch with the rest of the crowd. It relieved the boredom. I'd seen the two fighting before. They were rivals for the same woman. The crowd was shouting. The guards were taking bets. Bones were breaking when I spotted Larvik go into Vardok's office. After the look he gave me the night before, I had a sinking feeling. I tried to act like I was watching the fight, but I kept an eye on Vardok's door the whole time. When he and Larvik came out, Vardok looked at me, then at the woman. My blood ran cold. When he started toward her, a murderous rage welled up in me, and I pushed through the crowd to reach him. He was going to die before he could lay a filthy hand on her. I was an arm's reach away from him when he stopped, grabbed the closest woman to him, and dragged her into his room. I didn't care that she was going to suffer. I only cared that the woman I wanted was safe, for the time. An intense burning kept me awake nights thinking murderous thoughts, most centered on bashing Vardok's head in with the first big rock at hand. Had the chance arisen, I would have done it, even though I would have been killed, but my gnawing hunger to kill Vardok seemed impossible to satisfy. 2 guards with blasters always stayed with him, in the mines while he watched us work, and outside his door while he slept. After watching his guards for a while, I saw that they were less vigilant when Vardok was in his room with the lights out, so I looked for an opportunity. One sleep, I waited in the darkness with a rock in my hands. The guards had been lax all night, and it was time for Vardok to die. It'll work. Then what? I stared hard at the only old person I'd ever seen. Sometimes he'd show up and help the woman tend to the needy. Then he'd disappear. "That's my business," I stated with a glare that should have told him to leave, but he either didn't understand or didn't care. "What will you do after he's dead?" "Why do you care what I do?" I continued to stare, but he wouldn't look away. "When he dies, you and the girl will soon follow. Not without a fight. Alone against so many?" I looked at the people sleeping around me. "Do you see any fighters here?" "I see slaves and bullies. The bullies fight, but they only prey on the weak and run from resistance. Look for the ones with eyes like ours. They'll fight. Galak are born to fight." I'd never heard of Galak, and when I asked the old man what it meant, he just said, "Another time," and called a guard to take him out of the sector. The old man's words stayed my hand that sleep. Since the day of choosing was more than 20 sleeps away, I had time to consider options. "You Galak are born to fight," rang in my ears while I spent restless nights drawing pictures of Vardok dying at my hand. Eyes rarely met in the mines. People killed for less. Finding Galak fighters seemed hopeless, and I was about to give up my search for eyes like mine, like my mother's, when, passing through an unfamiliar sector, a disturbance caught my attention. A handler was beating a young man, a common scene, but neither the man nor the handler was behaving normally. The man should have been afraid, cringing. The handler should have been mocking and triumphant, but the look in the man's wild blue Galak eyes seemed to say, "You can beat me, but I won't be beaten." The handler's eyes had a look I'd seen at times in Vardok's, a mix of rage, hate, and fear. The next sleep, I went looking for the beaten Galak. When I found him and approached, I said, "I was watching you." He stared at me. "I'd kill these fools given the chance," I told him. "Aye," he agreed without breaking his piercing gaze. "We're not like most here." "Aye. I've been told that people with blue eyes like ours are called Galach and were born fighters." "Aye. We should look for more like us," I advised him and saw understanding in his eyes. The revolt had begun. "We are Galach." There was power in those words. When we spoke them to someone with our strange blue eyes, a readiness to fight flashed in them. We recruited, planned, and stayed ready. We were working a new face of rock when a large chunk of wall broke free and buried several workers. The handlers didn't care about the dead, but they ordered us to pull the bodies from the rubble to prevent the spread of stink and disease. We loaded the crushed slaves into a cart, and I was about to push it to the dump when I saw a bloody hand sticking out from the back of the rock slide. I started clearing the heavy rocks away and was hot and sweating when I felt cool, fresh air on my cheek. Even after the body was free, I kept pulling out rock until a large air shaft was exposed. I was about to tell a handler about it, but decided to keep it to myself. I had an idea. A chip of rock struck me above my brow one day, and I paused a moment to wipe blood from my eye when the expected came. I smiled as the barbs of Vardok's whip sunk into my chest. Enraged, he motioned to the guards to bring me to him. The sector stopped working to watch. The guards and handlers were also distracted by the show. Vardok took off his tunic and stretched his massive muscles as a guard wheeled in his rack of toys. He took his time selecting his first weapon, but he always chose the same one. He stepped in front of me with a staff in his hands, threw a quick glance at his audience, then sneered, "I start with staff, it make muscle soft. Aye, so you always say." I finished with a mocking grin. I wasn't prepared for the savagery of that blow. I hit the ground and Vardok beat me into unconsciousness. A dream awoke in the agonizing darkness. My tired young hands drop a stone. The first barb pins my ear to a beam and the rest tear into my chest. I stand on my toes to keep from ripping my lobe off, and Vardok roars out his laughter. "Look like puppet, dance puppet." I stare my defiance. He pulls back on his whip, and as the barbs sink deeper into my muscles, shouts, "Stone puppet! Stone!" Everyone throws rocks at me as Vardok jerks on his whip and chants, "Dance puppet! Dance!" I don't let him see my pain. "Stop throw!" He shouts to the crowd, and I think he's done with me. He smiles. I don't see the malice behind it. "Take down." 2 guards pull me free of the whip, and I drop to the ground. "Beat." I refuse to cry out from the agony of their kicks and blows. Vardok motions to the guards to stop. "My turn." He stomps my chest. I hear a loud crack and feel blinding pain. I struggle for every breath, then darkness overtakes me. Falling. The sound of water. I wake up on my blanket. Everyone is asleep. I see a chip of ilium and begin painfully scratching with it in the dirt. When the pain is too much to continue, I stick the oar in my torn earlobe and vow, I will never forget this night. I drop down on my bloody drawing of Vardok's whip in his severed hand, and sleep overtakes me. The dream ended, and I came to in a pool of blood running from my ear. Halfway to my feet, the barbs ripped into me again. Vardok snapped the whip down and pulled me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, and his whip tore into me again and again. When I regained enough strength to struggle to my feet, I heard the whip's tails singing toward me. I grabbed them. They wrapped around my arm, and the shards of ilium ore that studded them dug into my muscles. I squeezed tight and pulled. "Say goodbye to hands." Vardok laughed cruelly and snapped back hard. I leapt with the pull of his whip and slammed my head into his face. Blood was spraying from his nose as he staggered back, and I arced out with the sword I pulled from his rack of weapons. The shock of metal on bone ran up my arm. It felt good, natural, and it seemed to give me strength. Vardok was struggling for his last breath when I cut his whip hand off. The whip stayed in his grip. I tied my trophies to my waist. When Vardok died, so did most of the guards and handlers in the sector. The waiting Galach were fearless, merciless. We ran to the recent rockfall in the back of the cave and checked out the weapons we captured. We had 3 blasters and 5 swords. 27 of us went up the hidden air shaft behind the fall. As we climbed, we kept the guards below us pinned down by blaster fire. Then we came to a set of bars blocking any further progress up. There was talk of giving up, then someone said, "It's only rock, and pulled a hand sledge and chisel from his belt. Our hands were slick with blood from the climb, so we bound them with strips of cloth in order to hold on to our tools. It didn't take us long to cut the bars out. We threw some of the debris down on the guards below and used the rest for a blockade. It was slow work piling up the loose rock into a wall, but if it slowed them down, it would be worth it. While most of us worked on the blockade, others fired down the shaft to keep the guards at bay. When the wall was up, we rebound our hands for the climb. I went over to the woman to help her with her binding. Her hands trembled with pain, but she didn't make a sound. When I was done, I wrapped my arms around her. "We'll make it," I promised. She buried her face in my neck and let out a long sigh. "We have to go," I told the group when I finished taking care of my hands, and we continued up. She was right behind me when I heard her slip. She let out a gasp, and I reached for her, but it was too late. She never took her eyes off me the whole way down. I don't know how long I stared in horror into the abyss that swallowed her in darkness. She was gone. She was my reason for fighting, for running, for the long, bloody climb, and now she was gone. I was paralyzed with grief, the first I'd felt since my mother died. The only two people I ever cared for were gone. A shot from below brought me to my senses, and I continued up with a newfound determination. I was going to be free for her and my mother. Their deaths were not going to be in vain. Near the top of the shaft, we came to a long, dark tunnel with a glow of light at the end. When we reached the light, we saw, for most of us, our first glimpse of the outside, but the way was blocked by another set of bars. "No!" someone moaned. People started crying. "We can do it," a woman declared, and I said, "We can't give up now. We're almost there. We see the light and smell fresh air. One last obstacle and we're free. Why did we fight? Why are we climbing?" "No more whips!" the first Galak I found shouted and tackled the bars with renewed vigor. "No more beatings!" another Galak shouted and joined him. Soon everyone was working like they'd just had a long rest and a satisfying meal. We worked frenziedly on the rock trying to break the bars free, but our hands were too torn up to hold on to our tools. We could hear the guards getting closer as people were crying and tearing at the rock with their bloody fingers. We kept looking back over our shoulders, expecting the guards at any moment, and by the time we pulled 3 bars out, we were spent. The fight, the climb, was all too much. "We can't do it!" someone cried and sat down in defeat. Others joined him. "One more bar, and we can squeeze through," I shouted. "We're almost there." I wasn't going to give up. I turned back to the rock, and 4 people joined me. The bar was loose, and we were almost free, when I heard a hiss. The tunnel filled with red vapor and darkness overtook me.